Welcome to Teletubby Land. Once you've started the program and seen the introduction, you'll find yourself accompanying one of the Teletubbies inside the dome.
Uh-oh.
The pink animated cursor is your way of guiding the Teletubbies and starting the special events and activities. Moving the cursor over most objects or a Teletubby will initiate a response. Once an activity is started, its speed is dependent on how fast you move the cursor from side to side. When the cursor stops animating, it indicates that you are watching a non-interactive sequence. Inside the dome, you can start the games by moving the cursor over the active objects: the custard machine, the toast machine, and the toast on the table.
Yay!
If you want to repeat any of the games, interact with the Teletubbies when they ask. If you don't want to repeat the game, move the cursor away.
Lala went for a walk.
You can leave the dome at any point by moving over or clicking on one of the doors. And to return to the dome at any point, move the cursor to the bottom of the screen or over the dome whenever it appears in the landscape.
Lala walked all the way home.
In Teletubby Land, your Teletubby will set out on a walk. You can interact with the clouds, flowers, and rabbits.
Ooh. Rabbit. Ooh. Rabbit.
And the Teletubby's favorite thing, to prompt a response. Holding the cursor on the far right or left of the screen speeds up the Teletubby in the direction of the cursor. To start the activities, move or click your cursor over this special plant to bring on the magic drum.
Ooh. La la la.
Over a clump of blue grass to start the What's That activity.
Ooh. What's that?
Or over one of the pine trees to play the hiding game.
Red Tipsy.
There are other special events in Teletubby Land, including video. You can see these at any point, either by activating the windmill sequence in the top right-hand corner of the screen, or by clicking on the windmill whenever it appears in the landscape. To exit from a video sequence, hit the spacebar. You can change the lead Teletubby during the Going for a Walk activity whenever your current Teletubby meets another. Simply click or move the cursor over the new Teletubby. You can also change the lead Teletubby during the tuning in sequence before the video plays. Finally, to activate the exit sequence, move the cursor to the top left-hand corner of the screen, hold it there, and then click.
The sun is setting in the sky. Teletubbies, say goodbye.
Time for Tubby Bye-Byes.
Bye!
Bye-bye.